into it, make this a little bit faster. We got a lot to cover today because we've completed, at least somewhat completed, the headless architecture well enough to actually start using it. Um, I'm going to start really quick just by showcasing things that it looked like, then maybe jump into what things used to look like and what things look like now, and try to run through as much of the headless architecture as I can. Get everyone a good idea as to you know where we're at, where we're going, all that kind of stuff. So we'll do a couple screen shares. I'm going to bounce in and out. It's better than having this thing do the mirror effect when I come back over to here. So I'm going to try to do a share of just the items that I need. Let's see here. Yep, this one actually will work. Let's see here. First, we'll start by sharing this. And there we go. All right, so this is the checkbox component. Not really very difficult, not really complex. Hence why we decided that, or I decided that I would use this as the first component to convert to a headless component. And even as simple as this took a lot of doing, getting it done, a lot more than I actually thought, uh, which is how software goes usually. You never really know until you actually get into it. The one thing about this checkbox though is it doesn't just check and uncheck as you're seeing here, and has the nice little animation. Um, but you can also set it partially checked. This is supposed to have a set partially. Let's see here. That's using the state to check it. I know I had a test in here that had partial checking. This might be it. Ah, here we go. Set partial. Oh, look at that. It's actually broken. The partial checking is not working. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. I have not been able to test this yet, so we are definitely going to have to fix that. I still will go ahead and go through this, but you get the idea. Check, uncheck. There is a property for partial checking, which is what I thought this was supposed to do, which means that the partial checking is not fully working. So that's something I'm going to have to go into and dig into on Saturday. Anyways, we will go forward and we will talk about the headless framework and go through that. So here's what I'm going to do. We'll stop sharing, come back to here. I'm going to quickly, before I do the share, set up. I'm going to go to an old version of BSoft components, pre headless components here, so that you can see what the checkbox component looked like previously, and now what it looks like. Then what it looks like with everything else there. So we'll go ahead and we'll check out develop, and then I'll do a screen share. Let's just get over to the checkbox component. Okay. Now I'll share my screen for that. See here, window. There it is, BSoft components. Share. All right. So most of our stuff will be in here, so we can take a look at things. This is still, once again, like I said, pretty basic. It has a couple of key components. The component itself, there is some custom CSS. Yes, I am using Tailwind, but there are some things that are just easier to do sometimes with custom CSS. I'll jump over to that in a minute. Basically, props, ref, simple stuff, name, label, value, all that kind of stuff. We've got this item here, use state ref initial. That's a custom hook from BSoft Common. The idea is if the state is in its initial set value, then we know we need to do something else versus whether or not the state has actually changed since it was initially set. That's what this hook does. It basically tells us, is the state still in its initial state, or has the set check state function actually been called? Checked property and partial property is another part of this, because what we could have is that the state has been changed, it's been checked and unchecked, which would cause this state change in here. And then we suddenly pass in the partial property, from outside. So the user could actually say, okay, I want to set the checkbox to partial and could pass it into the partial prop instead of using the ref. If that happens, we need to know what has happened. So basically, we need to. There's a number of different things we have to take into account. I'm going to go through it here because this logic doesn't actually change in the headless component. It's just the structure at that point. So quite simple. If the check states in its initial, then base and we get updates in the actual checked or partial properties, then basically we fall into here and we just set whatever the state is to whatever the actual properties are, because we don't have to worry about it because the state hasn't changed. If the state has changed, then we have to go through a number of different checks. Each one, new check, new partial, goes through a series of checks. Check property, which is the function up here. Basically, if it has changed, the way this determines if it's changed is each time this is rendered, the property is checked against the previous property to determine if it has changed. If it has changed, then the change property gets set to true, and then we have the values, the actual value of the property at its time. So basically, that's what we're doing here. If the check property, so what we're doing here is if the check property has changed, then, or if it hasn't changed, then we use the actual state property. If it has changed, then we use the actual checked property. So in other words, basically what that's saying is if the checked property has changed, if it was, let's say, false and now it's true, then we want to go ahead and set new check to true. Same with partial. If it was false and now it's true, we want to go ahead and set new partial to true. Once again, we do our little calculation here. Basically, the way this is read is if partial is checked, checked has to be true as well. So if partial is true, checked has to be true. That's how the component communicates out if it's partially checked. Partial true, check true. Yeah, because it is still checked. In the reason I went that route is it is still checked. It's just partially checked, but it is still checked. So that's kind of my logic. So either it is checked without partial, checked with partial, or not checked. So that's the three states that the checkbox can exist within. This is pretty basic. Handle change event. It pretty much this comes from the actual input component, the actual checkbox input component that you'll see below. And that way, when the actual checkbox is checked, we get the actual event, and then we go ahead, we fire the event back out to the user through the on change, and we set the internal state to whatever the state value is. If an item is checked, partial is cleared out. Partial cannot be achieved by clicking the box, by clicking the checkbox. Partial can only be achieved by either setting it through the ref or by passing it through the property. So those are the only two ways partial can be set. So it can only be set programmatically. The user cannot put the checkbox into a partially checked state. We also have some ref items here to set partially checked and checked if the user wants to go that route instead of passing a property. So just kind of giving them all the different items that they could do. We've got our different styles to style the checkbox. The styling you saw there, all the different styling is all done through a number of different CSS. As you can see, most of this is Tailwind. And so even using custom SVGs to do the actual, that's the checkbox. The check and the partial check is done through a custom written SVG. I'm not going to go into these. You guys can look this up on the repo if you want to see it. It's in there. It's open for everyone to see. Here's the basics of the markup. It's really quite simple. The label is either to the left or to the right. That's determined by the label location property, which is defaulted to right, if I remember right. Yeah, it's defaulted to the right, which makes sense. That's what most checkboxes do. They have the label to the right. So yeah, we've got the label to the left, label to the right. Here's the actual working piece of the checkbox itself. The label wrapping the entire thing, which then feeds any kind of clicks back down to the components below. Here's the input. It's actually set to hidden. If you look at the inner checkbox styles, it's set to appearance none. That's the CSS properties being used to hide it. But that way, it's still functional. It just doesn't appear on the actual HTML. Like I said, there's a number of stylings going on here, but I could spend hours talking about the different stylings and what they do. Here's the SVG. Basically, If it's not partial, this is the check. This is the actual line, the SVG drawn line to make the checkbox. And if it is partial, this is just a straight line across. So pretty simple. That's pretty much it there. The custom CSS comes down to running things like the actual animate. This here is inside of Tailwind. If you go down to, I really don't want to dig into that. That would take a little bit too long. But yes, once again, you can dig in, and you can dig into my Tailwind config. Okay, it shouldn't take long. It's right there. There it is. It's basically this is the way in Tailwind you can set up, an animation name and all that. And this sets up the whole thing and how the whole bounce concept works. So if you go back to where I was there, I think I didn't actually open it properly. There we go. All right. Anyways, yeah. So pretty simple here. I'm using some basics to detect dark mode versus not dark mode. That's why you'll see not dark is dark. BSC dark is the name of the class that gets put on the in the body if you're trying to put the component into dark mode. Matter of fact, everything in BSoft components is prefixed with BSC. I use the Tailwind prefix to make sure it doesn't collide with other people's Tailwind styles in case they're using Tailwind. So yes, so not dark mode and then is dark mode is pretty much the same, just with different themes, basically. So yeah, this does the box shadow. This actually is the little thing drawn around there to give you the appearance that the box is there, even though it's, like I said, it's actually hidden. And then we use the concept of a box shadow that is sort of animated. This is where the animation part comes in. So the animation part comes in and actually draws the little bounce. This is how it's done. It's done by using the box shadow property. So when it's hovered, the box shadow is just around. You'll notice when you hover over the checkbox, you'll actually see it kind of raise up. It'll get a little bit bolder around the box itself. That's what this is doing here. And then once it's actually clicked, then it actually kind of spreads out, is what it does. It spreads out. And that's what causes it to kind of have that bounce animation. I'm going to skip over that because, like I said, it's just basically the dark mode version of it. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what animate bounce here is doing. Let's go ahead. I think that's pretty good coverage. Anyone can ask once this thing goes live. Like I said, I will be actually looking for any kind of questions so I can answer those at that time. Let's go ahead now and let's jump to the real meat of what we're going to be talking about here. So here's the headless checkbox work. So that was all of that work. Okay, so we still have the checkbox here. We still have the label. This I didn't go into the label component because basically all it is just a label. It's pretty simple, but it has some wrappers that put some custom styles in it to give us the styling that we're looking for. Now here's the meat of the work: the headless architecture, the headless components. So what we have here is we have we have quite a bit. Basically, we have the headless base component. We have a field component. Okay, so let's start with the headless base component. Actually, let's start with this. Let's start with going into the checkbox component itself, just to kind of show you the new checkbox component. So you've seen the old one. The new one basically has very little actual code in here. This I left in here simply because the concept of animating is specific to BSoft components, not to headless components. That's why this part's left in here. But the only thing that's left in here now is just the styles from before. So the styling is still within BSoft components, but all of the logic has now been moved into the headless components. That's really the idea of what's going on here. We've got a concept of a headless group. The headless group concept is basically if you want to pair two headless components together, you can basically do so with a group. Right now, the only thing the group defines is a shared ID between them. Anyone who knows anything about how HTML works, how labels work, how things like that, how that whole thing fits together, is in the example of a checkbox, what you do is you have what's known as the HTML4 property, or just 4 if it's just in HTML. And what you can do is you set the ID of an actual HTML input component, a checkbox in this case. And if you put that same ID in your for property of your label, when you click the label, it will check the item beneath it. It'll check the item that it's referencing. And that's what this is doing here. That's what the headless group is doing, is pairing all of this together so that we don't have to sit there and pass things around. As you noticed, label doesn't pass it. Label does have an HTML4. I'm going to bounce in real quick. It does have an HTML4 property that would be used to set the for. However, we don't need it here. We don't pass it here. The reason we don't pass it here is headless group is providing the for and passing it to the different components through a context. I might jump into that real quick. It's a really simple component. So actually, I will jump into that, but let me finish the explanation here. So we've got the label that was there before, but now the label itself, if you look, actually calls the headless label. So there is a headless component now that has the actual label in it, but has no styling with it whatsoever. So the styling still needs to be passed to the headless component to style it, but all of the functionality is in the headless component. So we just wrapped it in the label because the label has the styling that we want for BSoft components. Let me do this. Oops. Yeah, all right. Now we go back to here. This is the headless checkbox. This is where all of the logic that you saw previously in the checkbox is now inside of here. We will jump into that, but I do want to jump into the headless group because it's so simple. Basically, here's the headless group. The headless group creates a shared ID whenever it's created with the use ID, and it sets it to the context props, passes it through the headless group context provider to the children that are below it. So any of the children below it that are listening to the listening for the headless group context would then pick up this shared ID. That's how the whole thing works. Yeah, I can jump into that real quick too. Let's go over to the label component just to show you what I'm talking about in the headless label. It has the group content. It's picking up the group context through my custom hook that I created inside of there called use headless group context. Currently, the only thing in there is the shared ID. So this thing tries to determine how it's going to get its label ID, which is what it uses for the HTML4. If it's part of a group, it picks up the shared ID, and that's the label ID. If it's not part of the group, it looks at the HTML4. If not, basically, it's undefined, which it can be. So then it's passed the label. It all just sort of syncs up. That's how it works. So pretty basic, pretty simple, not too complex there. We'll jump into the headless checkbox too, just to kind of show that all the logic is there. So like I said, as before, all the logic is now moved over here, except for we have this group context in here. That's a new part which we had in the label. So this is the way, once again, these things marry up with each other. So here's the shared ID. Once again, the way what we set our ID to is the shared ID. Then we check if there's a props ID, and worst comes to worst, we go ahead and we generate our own internal ID, and we set that to the ID if nothing else is set. So at least we've got an ID set at that point. All the rest of the logic exists. Like I said, I seen that there is a problem with the partial checking. I am going to have to go through and fix that before this goes out. But the concept is pretty much there. This is one part that I think might change. I don't like the label in here. The only reason the label currently is in here is that's what got the whole styling working, and that's because the CSS, the way it was written, was expecting things to be in a very specific order, structurally wise. So I need to go back through the CSS, which is probably going to do I'm going to do tomorrow, is go through the CSS and make sure that I can make it work correctly. Then I can take this label out because I don't like the idea of a label being in there anyways. The main reason is I don't want users of the headless component to have a label in there if they don't want it that way. If they want it that way, they can do it themselves. If they don't have to. I'm trying to keep this thing bare minimum, exactly what needs to happen. Basically, what needs to happen is there needs to be something here to catch the on change and fire the on change, and that's what's happening here. That's really the only difference is the handle on change. Actually, it doesn't even look different, but it does function slightly differently. This actually is the exact same code as before, but now what it does is it fires its own on change that then the component that's using it can pick up the on change from within the component itself. But like I said, nothing really changed there. Now, here's where we get into the meat and potatoes of what we were talking about here. So the big stuff here, headless base. So headless base here, um, is basically it's actually quite small, which is good, and that was the point of this whole thing. This is not, like I said before, this is not the end all be all. So if you guys see something that's kind of like, hey, that doesn't look like a good idea, we will work this out. It is something that right now is done this way for this, and I say that because I really don't like the way this is done here. But I need to come up with a better way. But for now, this works. So we'll move forward with this, and as we start to put more components in there, we'll probably figure something better out, a better way of doing that. This here's a simple use effect for the context. That's the headless context here. The headless context basically is used to pass items between components that have multiple components. Once we get into more complex components, we're going to have components that have subcomponents in it. A good example is the date component. The date component has probably 7 or 8 different components within it. A calendar component, a date selector, a time selector, a date range selector, all of these different components that all need to communicate with each other. And that's where this headless context is coming in. It's basically going to pass itself around. So the headless context there actually is a context there. It's not used in the checkbox component because the checkbox component doesn't need it. But there is an actual headless provider component, and this is the one I'm talking about here. It's really quite simple. It just takes the headless context provider and passes the props to it. Right now, nothing really complex. Like I said, this probably will grow a little bit as it goes on, but you've not seen this used because currently the checkbox is only a single component and doesn't have any subcomponents. But once it does, this will be used to pass signals to the other components that will then, sometimes this thing does not do what I want it to do. Okay, that will then end up um, passing data around, because the one thing I don't want to do is have a context that then sits there and is constantly being called over and over again. Because I don't know how many of you know how React contexts work, but the way React contexts work is anytime the properties change, all components underneath that context are re-rendered, whether they need it or not. Signals, on the other hand, only change when the data for that signal changes, and only will change components in which they respond to data for the signal. So you can pass a signal to a component and it won't change if the actual data for that signal isn't accessed within the component. So you can use that component as a pass through to another component without having to worry about that component being re-rendered if the data isn't accessed for that particular signal, which is a really, really, really nice thing to have, especially if you're trying to keep things optimized and all that kind of stuff. So only components that actually need to change will actually need to re-render and change, which is really cool. That's why I chose that path for this, because now we'll have a single time that the context will re-render. We'll pass the different signals down to the different components. Each component will pick up the signal it needs, and then we'll utilize that. That's also what this does here. Basically, each component that uses the headless base can then retrieve its own signal. So that's kind of how this is working. The headless field right now is only HTML fields, but basically it's pretty simple. It's just an input component right now. The type is basically just of HTML input type attribute, which is basically any of the types that could be in a normal input type: checkbox, radio, in text, email, all the different ones that are available out there for input are there. Eventually, this will become more than just an input as we start to build more complex components that need other things. But for now, we're working on simple components, so let's keep things simple. Like I said, let's not try to go overboard. So that's pretty much the headless base, the headless field, and the headless provider, all covered. Let's quickly go through the let's see, your headless context. Okay, this is the context I was referring to that had passed stuff around. It's really quite simple. It's just an object with signals in it. It's an object with names and the signals in it. So basically, from the top level component. When we have subcomponents, we need to create an object that has names of the different signals and pass those signals there. The subcomponents themselves will be told what the name of their signal is, and then they'll be able to actually pick up their signal. So the headless base will pretty much do it for them. Hey, when it sees that the signal has actually been created and passed to it, it then fires the on signal created event back to the subcomponent, and now it has its own signal. And that should be the only time that it receives that. It basically just has to maintain it somewhere, put it into a ref, something like that. Um, Preact, which is the library that has signals, has a React version of the signal library, and they have if you use the use signal, I think it's called use signal, yeah, the use signal hook. What it'll do is it'll take that signal and it'll wrap it into a use memo with no dependencies, which basically means it'll never be recreated. So that's really so basically we don't have to worry about recreation. We don't have to worry about things causing extra renders. So the idea is to keep this thing minimum number of renders possible as fast as possible, so that the user can have a very performant headless base that they can work with and build their own components. Once again, this is very simple. We can move on. I'll just go to this just because it's pretty much the same thing, but the difference, like I showed, this is the group context. This is the item you saw earlier that was wrapped around the checkbox and the label. That's right now the only property. I'm sure we will find other things that we need to pass to everything, but for right now, that's what this is. Like I said, don't try to over engineer. Let's just get it out the door. Let's see here. What do we got? Components, common, headless group. Here's the headless group component. Really, really simple. It generates the shared ID. It sets it into a memoed context props so that it's not regenerated. This shouldn't be regenerating. This should only generate a single time from what I've seen. This is a new hook by React that came out not too long ago to use to generate completely unique IDs. So React generates them for you, so you don't have to worry about ID collisions and things like that. And then we just pass it through the context provider. So this is really just a wrapper for a context provider and this little piece of code right here. But it does its job. It basically pairs things together, and that's what it's supposed to do. Let's see here now. Headless label component. As I said, it's just a simple label. There it is. You've seen this before. Actually, I did go into this. So yeah, that's where it is. It's just there in the label. We're not going to go through the data. We've already gone through item scroller, but that's another one that's in there. Basically, the thing we actually worked on here was the headless checkbox component. As you've already seen it before. We've gone through this. I've explained about the label. Wow. I thought it would take a little bit longer to go through all that, but I guess that's pretty good. Yeah, I kind of like it here. I don't want this to be super long. What are we sitting at? Yeah, we're sitting about 30 minutes. Good, or close to 30 minutes. All right, so yeah, pretty basic. There is quite a bit of work that's gone on. So this was all created by me in about a week and a half. So I hope everyone understands what's going on. Please, if you like the idea of headless components, if you're getting into component development and things of that nature, and you want to have the understanding of the concept of headless components, please contact me. Ask anyone who's direct message me. I do my best to respond as quickly as I can. I can't always respond. I do have that time when I'm actually doing this silly thing called sleeping. Unfortunately, I need that. Although I know some of you are just insane and you can go without sleep. I wish I was like you. Really, I do. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I think we've gone through just about everything. That's good. That's good. Yeah. So let me go ahead and stop sharing. We'll go back to here. I hope you learned something. Like I said, ask questions while this is going on. Please ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Ask later, ask whenever. I'm always looking for responses. I'm always looking to help out people, and definitely to share about the stuff that I'm doing, which I find really interesting. So that's it for me. I'm gonna end this.